Hi, hello. My name is Megzy, and today I will be doing my October wrap up. I read a total of 8 books. These are 7. Even though the month is not over, I know that I will probably not finish any more before the month ends. So, without further ado, let's get into it. The first book I finished in October was The Vanishing Half by Bennett. This was a very, very popular book when it came out in 2020. It received a lot of press, a lot of acclaim. This is the story of two twin sisters who are light skinned Black women growing up in the 1960s in this fictional town in Louisiana called Mallard. And in this fictional town, everyone is a light skinned Black person, and they're all very much dedicated to intermarrying among themselves and being as close to white as possible. And so one day the girl's mother decides to pull them out of school and says, you have to start working and supporting the family. And so both the twins run off to New Orleans. It is there that one of the twins, Stella, gets a job by passing as white, and there she ends up dating and later marrying her boss, a white man. And then this whole pretense of passing just for her job ends up translating into the rest of her life. And so she completely just cuts herself off from her family and moves away into, I believe, a California suburb. And then Desiree, she ends up marrying a Black man who is, I can understand why some people had an issue with this. He's dark skinned and he's very violent. And she has a daughter named Jude. And then we don't really see too much of their marriage. It's told in flashbacks, but then she and Jude end up coming back to Mallard. And so Desiree and her mother always wonder what happened to Stella. This book follows, it jumps around from different time periods, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and it follows different perspectives, Desiree and Stella and Jude, and then also Stella's daughter, who looks completely white. She's a blonde woman. And overall, I really enjoyed this. I actually do think it is worth the hype. I would rate this 4.5 stars. For me, the only thing I would criticize about this was that it was just a little bit slow, the pacing in the beginning. And then I kind of feel like when we get to the second section, which follows Jude's perspective, I think it's like maybe 90 pages in, that's when the book really starts to pick up. But I think what was really well done was all of the characters in this, they're all very nuanced and complex and at times morally gray. I think overall, just the whole story is fascinating. It's definitely a nod to Nella Larsen's passing. I think for me, just why I would rate it 4.5 stars though, instead of a full 5, besides the pacing in the beginning, there were a couple things that I think were a little, like, this is very nitpicky, but it made me wonder. Stella always passing as white, like no one ever figured it out or even asked her, like, what are you? I mean, because if you're passing as white, you still look like a white ethnic. You look ethnically ambiguous. And so it made me wonder, like, did people never question, hey, what are you? Italian, Greek, Jewish, Portuguese? I mean, overall, I think this is a really good book. It does make me want to reread Nella Larsen's Passing. I think I might like that one just a smidge more because it's much more succinct and it's darker, but it really gets the point. It drives the point into the readers. So, but yeah, overall, I enjoyed this and I do think it was worth the hype. The next book I read was a memoir, and it is by Ariel Levy. It's called The Rules Do Not Apply. So I knew of Ariel Levy because in the 2000s, she wrote a book called Female Chauvinistic Pigs, Women in the Rise of Raunch Culture. And I have the book, actually. It hasn't aged well. And Ariel Levy is also a pretty notable writer for the New Yorker. This memoir I intensely disliked. And I feel a little weird saying that because it is, after all, a memoir. So it's very personal. And I feel like I am judging Ariel Levy, but that's essentially what I'm doing. This is a story, it follows her, a bit of her backstory growing up and becoming a writer, working for the New York magazine before she worked for the New Yorker, and her marriage to a woman. This is before gay marriage was legalized at the national level, and their disintegrating marriage, and then she getting pregnant and ultimately miscarrying during a trip to Mongolia. I don't know if I've read a memoir where I disliked the narrator as much as I did with this. Like, the last time I really disliked someone this much was Elizabeth Gilbert's Eat, Pray, Love. And I read that in 2008. So that's pretty bad. I think for me, Levy's thoughts on feminism are very odd to me and very surface level and shallow. And she muses a lot about women not being able to have it all, women not being able to have a really exciting, fulfilling career, but also be mothers. And I just find this whole like conundrum to be tiring and overdone. And it seems to come from this weird place of privilege. But I mean, she kind of blames feminism for not teaching women that they can't have it all, or telling women that they can delay their fertility. And I don't know what reality she's living in, because since women entered like white collar jobs en masse in the 1970s with second wave feminism, middle class women, because working class women and poor women always had to work. Keep that in mind. But when middle class women entered these white collar jobs, it was then that we heard the term biological clock come into play in the way that we now think of it. It used to just mean like the body's circadian rhythms. And that's when the media started really hammering it in. Oh my God, you're in your late 20s, you're in your early 30s, your biological clock is ticking, you gotta make a baby, you gotta settle down, you gotta find the right man, da, 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 da. And so for Levy to say, oh, like, you know, well, we were just taught that we could wait and delay motherhood until we were 40 is extremely disingenuous. And it sounds like she has her head in the sand or up her ass. I don't know. It was this weird blaming of feminism that like sounded almost like Jordan Peterson to me. There's also some really weird passages that just, I was like, ooh, did this woman have an editor? I mean, when she's in Mongolia and she miscarries, there's a point where she's taken by the EMTs or in the back of like an ambulance, and they give her a shot of something, and she's like, I worried they were going to give me Mongolian AIDS. This was published in 2017, so I just can't believe that escaped her editors. I don't know. There's the way she very briefly glosses over her marriage, and you would feel sympathetic to her because her partner ended up being an alcoholic. And I understand from like friends of mine who have loved ones who are alcoholics or addicts how that makes your life a living hell. But the way Levy acts in this, she cheats on her partner with someone, and the way I feel like the way Levy presents herself, what little we see of this marriage, you end up feeling more sorry for her wife than you do for Levy. Levy at one point goes to Al-Anon, and she has this very smug, pretentious view of it. Like, well, I'm not the one with the problem. Why do I have to be here? I mean, girl, really? So yeah, I did not vibe with this. I did not like this. The only reason I would give it 2 stars instead of 1 is because I do think she is a decent writer. She is a good writer. I just could not stand her in this. And it just had a lot of bad myopic takes. So, and I read a decent amount of memoirs, and I'm telling you that this one annoyed me almost on the same level as Elizabeth Gilbert's Eat, Pray, Love. So, not a good look. The next book I read was called Welcome Home, Stranger by Kate Christensen. This is a really short novel that I got in my little local lending library. It's about a woman named Rachel who is an environmental journalist working in DC, and her mother dies, and she comes back home to rural Maine, and she has to contend with her past and the relationship she and her sister had with their mother. Their mother was a very abusive, alcoholic, narcissistic mother. And I know that the term narcissist is definitely overused and misused, but the kind of abuse that is remembered in this book by Rachel and her sister is, I mean, it's a very unique kind of emotional abuse, because the mother didn't just cut her daughters down, she also would even like sexually compete with them with men. And that is one of the running like flashbacks memories Rachel has when she encounters a former on again, off again lover who is now married. I mean, overall, I've never heard of Kate Christensen, to be honest. I didn't know that she was such an acclaimed author. She won the PEN Faulkner Award for fiction in 2008. I thought this was very well written. I really enjoyed the descriptions of Maine. It's definitely a very fall vibes kind of book. The only thing for me, though, was that, I mean, other than all of us like facing our own mortality, because the protagonist is in her 50s in this book and facing memories of abuse and trauma and reconciling the past and like acknowledging you're getting older. Because Rachel is an environmental journalist, she also has a lot of like climate change, existential fear and dread. And understandably so, because it was her job. But this was interspersed throughout the novel in a way that the novel is very bleak. It's very well written, but it's very bleak. And it can feel a little bit heavy handed. And I normally don't have an issue with heavy handed books, but I don't know. There was something in this that felt, as I was reading it, a little equivalent to doom scrolling. So that was my only thing with this. Overall, I mean, I enjoyed it. I would rate it 4 stars, but I don't know. It did have that doom scrolling, doomerism quality to it. I mean, hey, yeah, they're not wrong, but I don't know. When I read fiction, I don't tend to like to think about the things too hard because I can just read the news. So, speaking of that, another really fun, cheery book that I read was called Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America by Ijeoma Oluo. I think that's how you say her name. She is Nigerian American. This book, it is very much of the time. It was published in 2019. And a lot of it, I think, is sort of like a reaction to pundits' analysis of the 2016 election and why Trump won, and how this is like what publications were putting out, that the Democratic Party focused too much on identity politics and not enough on the needs and concerns of white working class people in middle America. And this is something you'll hear over and over again, not just in liberal circles, but also in leftist circles as well. It is true that economic austerity does tend to lead to fascism, and fascism always blames minority groups for problems without really acknowledging that the problems are the people in power. But she writes this sort of as like a rebuttal that white supremacy and patriarchy have always been part of the United States since its very inception, as the United States is a settler colony. And the settler colony was founded on, the first chapter is literally about the massive genocide of Native Americans, because it was a genocide. And so she argues that these are like really intrinsic to America and that it's hard to disentangle from them. And she takes issue with the idea of the white working class being tricked to vote racist or being tricked to like embrace racism. Although like all this focus on like the white working class is interesting because a lot of Trump's base are like upper middle class people, white people, upper class, growing base of like people of color voting for Trump. I don't know. Some of her analyses I think are really spot on, and some of them just don't quite land. And I mean, the first chapter again is a lot about like Buffalo Bill and the genocide of the Native Americans. She critiques higher education. She critiques like white men and social justice movements, like leftist men. There was like 2 male socialists she criticizes. I honestly had never heard of them. And then she kind of like goes from that into like the Bernie bro movement. I think, like I said, there were parts that were really well done and a response to like this idea that like, oh, the Dems go too far on identity politics when like, oh, we have to like appeal to the white working class. That is in and of itself also identity politics, and identity politics are also civil rights. I mean, you can't really like say, oh, you know, you people of color, you LGBT people, you immigrants, you need to shut up because it's really, we have to cater to the majority. But I feel like this book, while she points out like so many of these issues are systemic, her like resolutions just aren't radical enough for something that is so deeply systemic. The chapter on women in the workforce for me leaned a little too much into girl boss feminism. She actually defends a couple female CEOs. And then we also get like this analysis, like pages and pages of the squad. You know, I mean, how they looked in 2019 is a little different than how they look now in 2024. And I'm also analyzing this in the, you know, days, a week out from our elections with Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee. And I feel like her solutions are just, we'll hire more female CEOs because that will get rid of, you know, the glass ceiling. And then women will like have paid maternity leave. Like, this is just not true. This is just categorically false. I have worked for companies that have female CEOs. There is no difference between working for a female CEO and a male CEO. And we need to hire more people of color in Congress because they'll like advocate on their own behalf. And it's just not true. It's just not true. To me, I feel like my beliefs tend to be more revolutionary and more nihilistic at the same time. And you're just not gonna defeat, like, white supremacy is so heavily entrenched into capitalism and as well as patriarchy. I mean, patriarchy is everywhere. And you're just like not gonna really defeat that by just electing a more diverse Congress. I mean, she acknowledges that people of color, they don't always advocate for their own interests. They act white or they act like white men. And I don't really think enough space here was really dedicated to a criticism of Barack Obama's presidency. She says he was very, very moderate. Maybe I'm just coming at this from more of a leftist perspective. And like I said, some chapters are stronger than others. The whole chapter on like football, she has a chapter about football and how, like, specifically the NFL players protesting against police brutality. And I felt like it would have been just more interesting just to read about the history of policing in general in the US instead of just reading more about like football, NFL players. That chapter kind of, my eyes started to glaze over. It felt like it was just from an entirely different book. I mean, I don't know. I guess my criticism of this is that her solutions to these problems just seem very liberal and not radical enough. So, yeah, I mean, maybe I am deeply cynical in 2024, and I think I have every right to be. That's the unfortunate reality of our political landscape here in the United States. But I mean, for me, this book, I would rate it 3.5 stars. It did inspire me to want to read a lot more books. I think this is maybe like a good starting point, but it's not like the end all be all. I mean, for me, I definitely want to read some Angela Davis, and I've wanted to for a while. So next video, I will definitely be reviewing Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle, but this on its own is just not sufficient enough, especially looking at this in 2024 and all the shit that's happened since then. The next book I read was called Earthrise, how it was a proofreading book, and I'll just put it right up here. Sorry, I don't have, I film on my phone, so I have to like look at my laptop. Earthrise. This was a quick book I proofread. It is like a middle grade book about the history of one of the Apollo flights prior to the moon landing with Neil Armstrong and the astronauts on that flight. They photographed the Earth from the dark side of the moon and everything leading up to that and the political climate at that time. And, just reading this book was just interesting because it was like, from a historical perspective, how much 20th century was shaped by this race, these frictions between the US and the Soviet Union. It's all what the space race was literally just the US and Soviet Union showing off to each other. Who can get there first? And how a lot hasn't really changed. I mean, there was a quote from MLK in this about how he criticized the US government's war in Vietnam and all of the spending that was going into that and the spending into NASA. And he's like, well, why? We're not fixing poverty in America. And I mean, this is just the same thing anyone could say today, even worse. I mean, it wasn't bad. I tend to proofread books. I feel like I've been pretty lucky because a lot of the books I proofread are kind of interesting. So they're not like a slog to get through. So yeah, I rated it 4 stars. And the next book I read on my own, that it was called The Space Between Us by Umrigar. I would rate this 3.5 stars. This was it is a lot about the big class divide in India and how it follows 2 women, Sarah, I think that's how you say her name, spelled Sera. She is a Parsi housewife. Parsis were an ethnic group that came from Iran, and then they settled in India centuries ago. They are Zoroastrian. And then Bhima, she is an illiterate woman who lives in the slums of Mumbai. This takes place in the early 2000s, India. But it just have this weird sort of like historical fiction feel to it. I can't quite place. And it tells the story of their 2 lives. Bhima is a servant in Sarah's household, and they have this like very deep bond, and yet they are also obviously divided by the constraints of their class. And we follow both of their lives, and both of their lives are extremely depressing. And this book for me, I already was in sort of a down mood in terms of like the books I had been reading, and this just kind of like really drove me into like, it wasn't really helping. It feels a lot kind of like misery porn, or just like poverty porn. Misery porn, I think, is the good word. And I mean, Sarah's life is her husband in this book. In the present, he has passed, but he was very, very abusive, and his mother was very, very abusive to her. And then we have Bhima's life, and Bhima's life is just one catastrophe after another. I mean, we see things like a husband who was injured in a factory accident, and then he does like a 180 in his personality and becomes a drunk, and there's people dying of AIDS. There's just like losing your home, getting tricked by con men into signing things you don't know because you are illiterate, losing your job. It was just like, it was one thing on top of another. And Umrigar, in the back of this book, because in the 2000s, HarperCollins did this like PS thing in the back of their books. My copy of The Bell Jar also has this, where they would have interviews with the author. They would have like an author summary. And so Umrigar had mentioned in this book that she didn't want The Space Between Us to be seen as a book about like a distant, alien, faraway culture with weird customs. And for people to not get the themes of this book are universal. And I don't know if she quite achieved that. There was something in this book that just felt very much like a sort of internalized Western eye. I don't know how to really put it into words. Maybe I'm just being really harsh, but I mean, she's a good writer, but for me, this was not quite like, it was solid, but it wasn't quite 4-star level, in my opinion. The next book I read that was really, really good, that I really loved, finally had a 5-star read, was Susan Choi's A Person of Interest. This takes from the case of the Unabomber and Taiwanese American who was falsely accused by the US government of sending nuclear secrets to China, Wen Ho Lee. This happened in 1999. And so this sort of takes and kind of mashes these two cases together in a novel. The story follows this man named Professor Lee in the 90s, teaches at a prestigious university. He's a mathematics professor, and his colleague, who's very popular, has a bomb mailed to him, and the bomb explodes in his office, and he is killed. And so Professor Lee, because he is seen as distant, aloof, he doesn't really seem to cope with the university's collective grief in a way that is seen as appropriate, because he is very much a loner, comes under suspicion by the FBI. This book it is very, very dense. I had to, her writing is just top notch. I have it when I enjoy even reading fiction books being challenged, and when I read this book, she used such vocabulary that I had to stop and look it up and like honestly read, like look up what these words were. I don't know, just everything, it has this sort of slow build, this ominous feel to it, not like in the line of a thriller, because I think that if you're looking for a very commercial thriller genre type of book, this is not it. It is very much a literary fiction book, but it definitely, it just hooks you in a way. And Lee and all the other characters are so fleshed out in such a way that feels so real. It feels almost like nonfiction in a sense, and yet you're still like led and wondering all along on the edge of your seat, like what is going to happen, what is going to happen. For me, I have no complaints about this book. It was extremely well written. I definitely want to read more of Susan Choi. This was published in 2008. The back of the book, this was for her book American Woman, which is also loosely based on Patty Hearst, another book I want to check out. Someone compared her writing to like Dawn DeLillo's Libra and Joyce Carol Oates' Blackwater. I mean, Oates and DeLillo are like authors I really love and admire. So, but I highly recommend this book. It deals a lot too with just how Asian Americans have been treated in this country, and just racially profiled and wrongfully imprisoned and things of that sort. So yeah, I definitely I like a thriller, but not in like your typical commercial kind of thriller, but like literary, very, very like intellectually dense. I definitely recommend this. And the last book I read in the month of October, this is a library copy, was Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. So I would rate this 3.5 stars. This was a little bit disappointing. I'm not gonna lie, it got such rave reviews all over TikTok, or not TikTok, BookTube, and so on. And I don't know. I mean, for me, I liked the last 3 stories the most. The last 3 stories are 8 Bites, The Resident, and Difficult at Parties. And I feel like if all of the book was on the level of those stories, I would have rated it like 4.5 stars. But some of the others, I was reading them and I get to the end and I'd be like, what is the point of this? These books deal a lot with like sort of body horror and also magic realism, I want to say, and a lot of it is very much focused on women's bodies and questions of sort of like feminist analysis, but in a way that it doesn't really like beat you over the head with it. Just like women in like sort of typical like domestic fiction, everyday life stuff. Women as mothers, women in marriages, women as sales clerks in dress shops, women having gastric bypass surgery, that sort of like typical, like everyday mundane life, but that still demands the way like society and relationships demand a lot out of women in a way that can feel very too much, very like demeaning, dehumanizing. And so, like I said, she deals with these a lot with like elements of like magical realism and body horror. And I thought, like, this sounds right up my alley, but I don't know, like some of these stories just didn't hit home for me. The Husband Stitch is based on a book, a story, you probably know it as a child, you read it, called The Green Ribbon. And a lot of people thought this was like the strongest story of the book, and I just didn't really. I read it and I was like, okay, I don't. There's one story that is basically like a retelling of a bunch of episodes of Law and Order, and I could see what she was doing, but then it just kind of got a bit repetitive. But the stories I did really like, 8 Bites is like a woman who gets gastric bypass surgery, and then she has sort of like the body of her dreams, but she still has never really faced self-love, I guess, in a sense. And she finds something in the basement that is representative of like her own past self, or like her own self and her own internalized self-loathing. The story, The Resident, is about a woman writer who goes, this to me was like the standout. It's about a woman writer who goes, I believe, in like upstate Pennsylvania to like a writing residency, and it's very eerie. She's like basically in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of other writers or artists, really. They're all different kinds of artists, sculptors, painters, and she slowly feels like she's beginning to go mad, and everyone else also feels like they are beginning to go mad. It very much has a slight Shining aspect to it. This, for me, like I said, my favorite of the collection. Also enjoyed Difficult at Parties, which is about a woman reconciling and just trying to adjust back to normalcy after being violently raped by a home intrusion. And she tries to like ignite the spark between her and her boyfriend by watching porn films, but yet she starts to like hear the internal dialogue of the actors on the screen, and it like doesn't go away every time she watches these films. For me, I enjoyed those stories the most, but the rest of the collection, it was just like so for me. So yeah, again, a mixed bag. Some really good stories, some meh. I would rate it 3.5 stars. So yeah, that is my entire October wrap up of 8 books. That's it. I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.